Cop bullies a deaf man, unaware he's retired police commissioner. The evening sun cast long shadows across the tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge Heights, where colonial-style homes worth millions stood like sentinels of privilege. James Holloway's 1967 Mustang rumbled softly through the neighborhood, its deep blue finish catching the golden light. At 68, James still took immense pride in the classic car he'd restored with his own hands during the rare quiet weekends of his career as police commissioner. The visit with his granddaughter Sophie had been the highlight of his week. At 7 years old, she was already learning sign language to communicate with her. Pop pop, adapting to his condition with the innocent flexibility only children possess. James smiled at the memory of her small hands forming the signs for "I love you" as he'd left her home. 3 years had passed since the warehouse explosion that had stolen his hearing, his final case before an early retirement. Sometimes he still woke in the middle of the night, feeling the concussive wave that had thrown him across the room, but never hearing the deafening boom that had changed his life forever. James checked his rearview mirror, a habit ingrained from decades in law enforcement. A patrol car had appeared behind him, lights flashing. He hadn't noticed it before, one of the many adjustments he was still making to a world without sound. James immediately signaled and began to slow down, looking for a safe place to pull over. Officer Travis Cole tapped his fingers impatiently against the steering wheel of his patrol car, scowling at the Mustang. He'd been watching these streets for suspicious vehicles all afternoon, code for anything that didn't belong in this wealthy enclave. The classic car with its older driver had triggered his radar immediately. "Got one," he muttered into his radio. "Old blue Mustang moving slow through Oak Ridge. Driver doesn't look like he belongs here." "Copy that," came the disinterested reply from dispatch. "Running the plates now." Travis didn't wait for the results. He flipped on his sirens and lights, expecting immediate compliance. When the Mustang continued at the same pace, Travis felt a familiar surge of anger rise in his chest. "Thinks he's too good to pull over," he growled, pressing the accelerator and closing the gap between their vehicles. Inside his Mustang, James remained unaware of the siren's wail. He noticed the patrol car had moved closer but assumed the officer was simply passing through. It wasn't until Travis laid on the horn, a vibration James could feel through his seat, that he realized he was being pulled over. With practiced calm, James guided his car to the curb, switched off the engine, and placed his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the proper position he'd taught to countless officers during his 30-year career. He took a deep breath, already anticipating the communication challenge ahead. Travis slammed his door shut, adjusting his belt as he approached the Mustang. His body language broadcast aggression, shoulders squared, jaw set, right hand resting near his holster. Through the driver's side window, he could see an older black man sitting perfectly still, eyes fixed forward. "License and registration," Travis barked, standing slightly behind the driver's door where he couldn't be clearly seen. James remained still, hands on the wheel. He couldn't hear the command or see the officer's lips to read them. Travis's face flushed with anger. He rapped his knuckles hard against the window, the vibration startling James, who turned with a questioning expression. "I said, license and registration," Travis shouted, enunciating with exaggerated motions that had nothing to do with helping communication and everything to do with expressing his mounting frustration. James recognized the situation immediately. He'd been through this before. Slowly, he pointed to his ear and shook his head, then gestured toward the glove compartment, seeking permission to reach for his identification and the card explaining his condition. To Travis, the gestures looked like dismissal and defiance. "Oh, so you're ignoring me now?" he snapped, yanking the door handle. Finding it unlocked, he wrenched the door open with unnecessary force. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, grabbing James's arm. Startled by the sudden physical contact, James tried to sign that he was deaf, his hands moving in the practiced motions he'd learned in the years since losing his hearing. His wallet fell from his lap onto the pavement. Travis saw only resistance. "Stop resisting and exit the vehicle now," he shouted, pulling James from the driver's seat with a forceful yank that nearly caused the older man to lose his footing. James's face remained remarkably composed as he was manhandled toward the hood of his own car. Decades of law enforcement had taught him that escalation only led to more violence. He allowed himself to be pushed forward, his cheek pressed against the still warm metal of his beloved Mustang. Across the street, Marissa Chin had been walking her dog when she noticed the confrontation. She quickly pulled out her phone and began recording, her hands shaking slightly as she captured Travis's aggressive actions. "He's just an old man," she whispered to herself, horrified as Travis roughly patted James down. Travis leaned in close to James's ear, unaware that his words went unheard. "You think you can just drive through here like you own the place? Think the rules don't apply to you?" He pressed James harder against the hood. "When an officer gives you an order, you comply. Period." James tried once more to sign his condition, his right hand forming the familiar gestures, but Travis grabbed his wrist and forced it behind his back. "Still resisting, huh? You stubborn old man, you think you're above the law?" From down the street came the sound of another patrol car approaching. Sergeant Keith Daniels had been nearby when he heard Travis's call about a suspicious vehicle. Something about his junior officer's tone had concerned him enough to check it out personally. As Daniels pulled up to the scene, he immediately recognized the distinctive blue Mustang. His heart sank as he saw the elderly man pressed against the hood, Travis applying handcuffs with unnecessary zeal. "Oh God!" Daniels muttered, quickly exiting his vehicle. "Cole! Hold up!" he called out, jogging toward them. Travis glanced up with annoyance. "Got this handled, Sarge. Just a stubborn old..." But Daniels wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on the face of the man being handcuffed, the same face that had stared down from the portrait in headquarters for years, the same man who had pinned Daniels' sergeant badge on his uniform 7 years ago. "Commissioner Holloway?" Daniels asked, his voice barely above a whisper as the gravity of what was happening washed over him like ice water. And in that moment, as recognition dawned in Daniels' eyes, Travis felt the first inkling that he had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Cole?" Sergeant Daniels hissed, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the evening air. His eyes darted between the handcuffed former commissioner and the growing crowd of onlookers gathering on the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Heights. Travis stiffened, his hand still firmly gripping James's shoulder. "This suspect refused to comply with..." "That suspect is James Holloway," Daniels interrupted, stepping closer. "Former Police Commissioner James Holloway." The color drained from Travis's face, but stubbornness quickly replaced shock. "With all due respect, Sarge, I don't care if he's the mayor." He ignored direct commands and resisted. "He's deaf, you idiot!" Daniels' control finally snapped. "He lost his hearing in the line of duty. It's in his file, which you'd know if you bothered to wait for dispatch to run his plates." A murmur rippled through the gathering neighbors. Marissa Chin, still recording, edged closer, her dog forgotten at the end of its leash. James remained motionless against the hood of his Mustang, dignity intact despite the metal biting into his wrists. Only the slight tremor in his weathered hands betrayed his true feelings, not fear, but a deep disappointment that cut worse than any physical discomfort. Travis's jaw clenched. His eyes darted around, suddenly aware that every window in the neighborhood seemed to contain watching eyes, every smartphone capturing his humiliation. But something in him refused to back down. "He should have a placard or something," Travis muttered, doubling down rather than admitting error. "How was I supposed to know?" "He tried to tell you." Daniels reached for James, gently turning him around. "Commissioner, I'm so sorry about this. Let me remove these cuffs." James nodded, his expression softening as he recognized Daniels. The younger officer's face was familiar, one of the promising rookies he'd mentored before the explosion changed everything. As Daniels reached for his keys, Travis suddenly stepped between them. "I placed those cuffs on him. I'll decide when they come off." Daniels froze, disbelief etched across his features. "Stand down, Officer Cole," he ordered, voice dropping dangerously low. That's a direct order from your superior. He disrespected a police officer. Travis insisted, his ego now fully in control of his actions. Deaf or not, he needs to learn. I said stand down. Danielle's voice boomed across the street, causing several bystanders to flinch. Birds scattered from a nearby tree. In the ensuing silence, James began to move his hands deliberately and practiced sign language. His fingers formed words that neither officer could understand, but the calm dignity with which he communicated spoke volumes. Marissa stepped forward, her phone still recording. He's signing, she said quietly. My sister is an interpreter. Travis shot her a venomous look. Stay back, ma'am. This is police business. Is it police business to throw an elderly deaf man against a car? She challenged, surprising herself with her boldness. I've recorded everything. He was clearly trying to communicate his disability to you. More phones emerged from the growing crowd. Someone whispered, I'm sending this to Channel 8 News. James winced slightly as the handcuffs dug deeper into his wrists. A lifetime in law enforcement had taught him the dangers of a public confrontation spiraling out of control. He caught Danielle's eye and nodded toward the keys again, a silent plea to de-escalate the situation. Daniels understood immediately. He stepped around Travis and quickly unlocked the cuffs, supporting James's arm as the older man straightened, rubbing his wrists. Thank you, Keith. James signed, mouthing the words simultaneously. Years of speech therapy before his deafness allowed him to form the words clearly, though he could no longer hear his own voice. Travis's face contorted with anger at being undermined. You're making a mistake, he growled at Daniels. We look weak when we... No, Officer Cole, Daniels cut him off. The mistake was already made. By you. He turned to James. Commissioner, do you need medical attention? I can call an ambulance. James shook his head and signed slowly, making deliberate eye contact with Daniels. He's asking for paper. Marissa interpreted, still recording. To write. Daniels quickly produced a notepad from his breast pocket. James took it, his handwriting neat and precise despite hands that trembled slightly. I am fine. Please calm the situation. Too many people watching. Travis, reading over Danielle's shoulder, scoffed. So now he's giving orders? No, Daniels snapped. He's teaching you how to defuse a situation, which apparently you never learned at the academy. A patrol car pulled up behind Danielle's vehicle, backup responding to the call Travis had made earlier. The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people, many with phones raised. James wrote again, My ID and deaf identification card are in my wallet. It fell by the car door. Daniels nodded and retrieved the fallen wallet, handing it to James with evident respect. Commissioner, I apologize on behalf of the department. This should never have happened. As James pulled out his ID and a laminated card explaining his condition, Travis's radio crackled with a delayed message from dispatch. Unit 317, be advised, vehicle registered to James Holloway, former police commissioner, residence on Maple Street. Subject has medical flag, hearing impaired. Proceed with appropriate protocols. The timing couldn't have been worse. Every nearby civilian heard the message clearly. You knew, Marissa said, her voice rising with indignation as she addressed Travis directly. Your dispatch just told you he's deaf and you still threw him to the ground? What kind of cop does that? Back up, ma'am, Travis warned, his hand shifting instinctively toward his belt. James saw the movement and reacted with surprising speed for his age, stepping between Travis and Marissa. His eyes locked with the young officers, years of command authority evident in his unwavering gaze. The standoff lasted only seconds, but in that moment, everyone present understood who truly held the power, not the uniformed officer with a badge and gun, but the elderly deaf man whose quiet dignity made Travis's aggression look exactly like what it was, the desperate flailing of a bully who'd picked the wrong target. And as the videos of their confrontation began uploading to social media, the stage was set for a reckoning that would extend far beyond this quiet street in Oak Ridge Heights. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Officer Travis Cole, Sergeant Keith Daniels, and former Commissioner James Holloway stood locked in a triangle of conflicting energies: anger, respect, and dignified patience. The growing crowd of onlookers had formed a loose semicircle around them, every phone camera aimed like weapons in a standoff. Lieutenant Maria Vasquez's unmarked car pulled up silently, its headlights cutting through the twilight that had descended on Oak Ridge Heights. As night watch commander, she'd been alerted by dispatch about a situation developing with one of her officers. As she stepped out of her vehicle, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. She assessed the scene with practiced efficiency. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of James Holloway standing between Officer Cole and a civilian woman. Even from a distance, she recognized the former commissioner immediately. "Oh, Christ!" she muttered under her breath, making her way through the crowd with authoritative strides. "Clear a path, please. Police business." Daniels spotted her and visibly relaxed. "Lieutenant," he called, relief evident in his voice. "Sergeant Daniels," she acknowledged, then turned to James with genuine warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. "Commissioner Holloway. It's been a long time." James nodded, recognition lighting his eyes. He had personally overseen Vasquez's promotion to lieutenant 8 years earlier, impressed by her dedication and intelligence. He raised his hands to sign, then remembered and reached for the notepad instead. Before he could write anything, Travis stepped forward. "Lieutenant, I was conducting a routine traffic stop when this civilian became uncooperative and—" "Shut up, Cole!" Vasquez cut him off without even looking at him. Her focus remained on James. "Commissioner, are you all right? Do you need anything?" James wrote quickly, "I'm fine. No harm done. But this situation needs to be defused." Vasquez read the note and nodded. "Of course." She turned to address the crowd. "Folks, I appreciate your concern, but we have this under control now. Please return to your homes." No one moved. A middle-aged man in golf attire called out, "That officer assaulted a deaf senior citizen. We all saw it. I have it all on video," Marissa added, holding up her phone. "He threw Commissioner Holloway against his car when he was just trying to tell the officer he couldn't hear." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Someone at the back shouted, "It's already got 300 views on Twitter!" Vasquez's expression darkened. She'd spent 15 years working to improve community relations, and in 5 minutes, Officer Travis Cole had undone years of progress. She turned to him, voice low and dangerous. "Officer Cole, return to your vehicle and wait for me there." Travis stiffened. "With all due respect, Lieutenant, I was following procedure for a non-compliant." "I don't care who he is," Vasquez mimicked in a whisper that only Travis could hear. "He disrespected a cop." "Isn't that what you said to Sergeant Daniels? About the former police commissioner who lost his hearing in the line of duty?" The blood drained from Travis's face. "How did you?" "It's already online, Cole." "Everything you said?" "Everything you did." Vasquez's eyes flashed with controlled fury. "Vehicle. Now. That's an order." Travis hesitated, his jaw working as he struggled with his pride. Then, with a stiff nod, he turned toward his patrol car. "And leave your keys with Sergeant Daniels," Vasquez added. "You won't be driving a department vehicle tonight." A ripple of satisfaction moved through the crowd as Travis reluctantly handed his keys to Daniels and walked to the passenger side of his patrol car, every step heavy with humiliation. James watched the exchange with a complex expression, part satisfaction, part sadness. He'd seen officers like Travis Cole before, young men who misunderstood the badge as a license for power rather than a symbol of responsibility. His gaze met Vasquez's, and a silent understanding passed between them, forged from decades of shared experience in the force. James wrote again, "I would like to go home now. This has been exhausting." Vasquez nodded. "Of course, Commissioner. Sergeant Daniels will escort you. And I promise you, this incident will be thoroughly investigated." James looked at his Mustang, then at his still trembling hands, and shook his head. He wrote, "Not sure I should drive tonight." "I'll take you, sir." Daniels volunteered immediately. And we can arrange to have your car delivered to your home. As the arrangements were being made, Marissa approached James hesitantly. Commissioner Holloway, she began, then realized her mistake and switched to basic signs she remembered from a college class, pointing to her phone, then making a gesture of deletion. James smiled gently and shook his head. He wrote on the notepad, "Please don't delete the video. It's important evidence of a larger problem." Marissa nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about systemic issues affecting vulnerable communities. "I'll make sure it gets to the right people," she promised. As Daniels guided James toward his squad car, a local news van pulled up at the corner of the street. The crowd parted to let them through, many reaching out to touch James's shoulder or arm in silent support. Travis watched from the patrol car, his face a mask of barely contained rage. As Daniels helped James into the passenger seat of his cruiser, their eyes met briefly. The look Travis gave the former commissioner wasn't one of remorse or understanding. It was cold hatred, the wounded pride of a man who couldn't accept his own mistake. In that moment, James realized this incident wouldn't end here on this quiet street. This was just the beginning. Later that night, as Daniels drove him home, James watched the city lights blur outside the window. He couldn't hear the sirens in the distance or the soft radio chatter from the police band, but he could feel the vibrations of the city, his city, through the glass. He dedicated his life to protecting it, to building a police force that served with honor rather than dominated with fear. As they pulled into his driveway, James's phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from his daughter. "Dad, you're all over the news. Are you okay? Call me right now." And as neighborhood lights flickered on around him, James Holloway understood that retirement had just ended. He had one more battle to fight, perhaps the most important one of his career. Chief of Police Raymond Greer's office was rarely occupied at 7 a.m., but this morning was different. The blinds were drawn tight against the morning sun, and four senior officers sat in tense silence as a laptop played Marissa Chen's video for the third time. 2 million views overnight, Deputy Chief Winters said, scrolling through her phone. "It's the lead story on every local station, and CNN just picked it up." Chief Greer, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and perpetually tired eyes, closed the laptop with a decisive click. He'd been appointed 3 years ago, after James Holloway's retirement, and had never faced a PR crisis of this magnitude. "Where's Officer Cole now?" he asked, his voice deliberately calm. "Administrative leave, effective immediately," Lieutenant Vasquez reported. "I confiscated his badge and service weapon last night." Greer nodded. "And Commissioner Holloway?" "At home," Sergeant Daniels answered. "His daughter's with him. He refused medical attention, but I noticed bruising on his wrists and right shoulder when I escorted him inside." Winters winced. "Perfect. So now we have photos of an elderly deaf hero's injuries to look forward to. I've scheduled a press conference for noon," Greer said, checking his watch. "That gives us 5 hours to get in front of this. I want to speak with Holloway personally before then." "Sir," Vasquez interjected, "with all due respect, maybe we should let the commissioner have some space. The man was just—" "Space isn't a luxury we have right now, Lieutenant," Greer cut her off. "Half the city is calling for Cole's head, and the other half is questioning our entire department's training protocols. I need to hear from Holloway himself what he wants us to do." 20 minutes later, Greer's unmarked car pulled up to James Holloway's modest colonial in the older part of town. The former commissioner had never moved to a fancier neighborhood despite his rank, preferring to stay close to the community he'd grown up in. As Greer approached the front door, he spotted camera crews setting up across the street. News traveled fast. He rang the doorbell, knowing it would trigger a light system inside that James had installed after losing his hearing. The door opened to reveal Catherine Holloway, James's daughter. At 42, she had her father's determined eyes and analytical expression. "Chief Greer," she said coolly. "My father's resting." "I understand, Dr. Holloway," he replied using her professional title. Catherine was a well-respected neurologist at University Hospital. But I need to speak with him. It's urgent. She studied him for a moment. You could have called first. You know he has video relay service. This needed to be in person. Catherine sighed and stepped back, allowing him inside. 5 minutes. And if he seems tired, you leave immediately. James was sitting in his living room, reading, glasses perched on his nose as he scrolled through news coverage on his tablet. He looked up as they entered, nodding at Greer with formal politeness. Catherine signed rapidly to her father, who nodded and set his tablet aside. He picked up a notepad from the coffee table and wrote, "Hello, Ray. Didn't expect to see you so soon." "Commissioner," Greer began, then paused. "James, I came as soon as I saw the video. I want to personally apologize for what happened. Officer Cole's actions were completely unacceptable." James wrote, "Apology accepted. But this isn't just about me." "I know," Greer admitted. "The department's taking a beating. We're implementing immediate review of our protocols for interacting with hearing-impaired citizens." James's expression hardened. He wrote quickly, "Deaf, not hearing-impaired. And implementing reviews sounds like bureaucratic stalling." Greer shifted uncomfortably. "We've placed Officer Cole on administrative leave pending an internal investigation." Catherine, who had been interpreting with sign language, snorted. "Administrative leave? So he gets a paid vacation while my father nurses bruises?" "It's standard procedure," Greer began. James touched his daughter's arm gently, then wrote, "What do you need from me, Ray?" The direct question caught Greer off guard. "Honestly? We need you not to sue the department. And we'd appreciate if you could make a statement about your confidence in our ability to handle this internally." Catherine's eyes flashed with anger, but before she could speak, James was already writing, "I won't press charges. But I won't lie for you either." He flipped to a new page and continued, "This happened because your officers aren't trained to recognize or communicate with deaf citizens. How many others like me have been mishandled? People without my connections or resources?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Greer had no ready answer. James wrote again, his pen pressing harder into the paper. "I spent 30 years building community trust. I won't help you sweep this under the rug." A knock at the door interrupted them. Catherine excused herself, returning moments later with a laptop. "Dad, there's a video call for you. It's Marissa Chen, the woman who recorded everything." James nodded and opened the computer. On screen, Marissa appeared, flanked by several people Greer didn't recognize. One was signing rapidly. "Commissioner Holloway," Marissa began while the interpreter signed. "I'm here with the directors of the State Association for the Deaf. They've been collecting stories from deaf individuals who've had similar encounters with police. Your incident isn't isolated, it's part of a pattern." James's eyes widened slightly. He typed a response that appeared on screen. "How many cases?" 17 documented in our city alone over the past 2 years, replied a professional-looking woman beside Marissa. "Most never reported because the victims felt powerless." Greer watched as James's expression transformed from personal indignation to something more resolute, a look he remembered well from their years working together. It was the face of a man who had found a mission. James typed, "Send me everything. I'll call you back in an hour." After ending the call, he turned to Greer with newfound energy. He wrote, "You wanted a statement? You'll get one. But not the one you came for." Outside, the number of news vans had doubled. James stepped to the window, watching the gathering media with a contemplative expression. Catherine placed a hand on her father's shoulder. "Dad, are you sure you want to get involved in this? You've earned your retirement." James smiled sadly and wrote, "Some fights choose you." He turned back to Greer and wrote one final note. "Tell Officer Cole I won't be pressing charges. But tell him also that this isn't over. Not by a long shot." As Greer left the Holloway residence, his phone buzzed with an alert. The video had just been featured on Good Morning America, and hashtag Justice for Holloway was trending nationwide. Damage control was no longer an option. A reckoning was coming. The community center auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Every seat taken, people lined the walls, and a cluster of reporters occupied the back of the room. On the makeshift stage, James Holloway sat beside an ASL interpreter, his posture straight and dignified despite the events of the past week. "Thank you all for coming," Catherine Holloway said into the microphone, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "My father has prepared a statement, which I'll read while Monica interprets." She unfolded a neatly typed page and began to read. 3 days ago, I was pulled over while driving home from visiting my granddaughter. What should have been a routine traffic stop became a physical confrontation when Officer Travis Cole mistook my inability to hear for defiance. This incident wasn't just a personal humiliation, it was a stark reminder of how easily the deaf community can be misunderstood, mistreated, and marginalized, even by those sworn to protect us. A murmur ran through the crowd. On the front row, Marissa Chin nodded encouragingly. "But I'm not here to talk about what happened to me," Catherine continued reading. "I'm here because of what I've learned since. In the past 48 hours, I've received over 200 messages from deaf individuals sharing similar experiences. People who were handcuffed for ignoring commands they couldn't hear. People pepper-sprayed for resisting when they tried to sign. People who now drive in fear of being pulled over." James's gaze swept across the room, making eye contact with several deaf attendees who nodded in solemn recognition. "As your former police commissioner, I believed I had created a department that served all citizens equally. I was wrong. Today I'm announcing the formation of the Holloway Initiative for Police Accountability and Training, specifically focused on interactions with the deaf community and other differently abled citizens." Behind him, a screen displayed the initiative's logo, a stylized hand making the ASL sign for "Protect" above a police badge. "We have 3 primary demands," Catherine read, her voice growing stronger. "First, mandatory training for all officers in basic sign language and protocols for communicating with deaf citizens. Second, immediate implementation of visual cards in all patrol cars to facilitate communication during traffic stops. And third, an independent review of all complaints filed by deaf citizens in the past 5 years." The audience erupted in applause. Camera flashes illuminated the room. "I won't be pressing charges against Officer Cole," Catherine continued when the noise subsided. "Not because I excuse his actions, but because this isn't about one officer, it's about a systemic failure. My fight isn't with Travis Cole. It's with the system that failed to train him properly." From the side of the stage, Chief Greer watched with a carefully neutral expression. He'd been invited as a courtesy, but James hadn't shared the content of his statement beforehand. As Catherine finished reading, a local news reporter stood. "Commissioner Holloway, sources tell us the police department is conducting an internal investigation. Do you have confidence in that process?" James smiled slightly and signed his response, which the interpreter voiced. "Internal investigations have their place. But true accountability requires external oversight. That's why I've accepted Governor Williams's invitation to lead a statewide task force on police interactions with the deaf community." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. This was news to everyone, including Chief Greer, whose expression darkened noticeably. Another reporter called out, "What about Officer Cole? Do you think he should be fired?" James signed deliberately. "Officer Cole's future with the department isn't my decision. But I believe in second chances, if they're coupled with genuine accountability and learning." After the press conference, as James made his way through the crowd, a young deaf woman approached him. Her hands moved rapidly in sign language, tears streaming down her face. The interpreter beside James translated. "She says her brother was arrested last year when he couldn't hear police commands during a traffic stop. He spent 3 nights in jail before they found an interpreter. She wants to know if your initiative will help people like him." James nodded and signed back. "That's exactly why we're doing this. No one should face what your brother experienced, or what I experienced, ever again." As the days passed, James's campaign gained momentum. The video of his encounter with Travis had now been viewed over 20 million times. National media picked up the story, framing James as a crusader for both police accountability and disability rights. Meanwhile, the police department found itself under unprecedented scrutiny. An initial statement defending Officer Cole's actions had backfired spectacularly, forcing Chief Greer to hold a second press conference announcing Cole's suspension without pay pending a full investigation. Travis Cole's personnel file was leaked to the press, revealing 2 prior excessive force complaints that had been dismissed without action. Public opinion turned sharply against him, with protests forming outside police headquarters demanding his termination. The governor's task force announcement accelerated everything. Suddenly, what had been a local incident became a catalyst for statewide policy change. 3 neighboring states announced plans to review their own training protocols. James found himself working 14-hour days, meeting with advocacy groups, consulting with police trainers, and drafting policy recommendations. His hearing loss, once a private struggle, had become the centerpiece of a movement larger than himself. 1 month after the incident, James stood at the podium in the state capitol building as the governor signed Executive Order 2387, mandating comprehensive deaf awareness training for all law enforcement officers statewide. As cameras flashed, James couldn't help but reflect on the strange irony. His most significant contribution to policing might come not during his 30 years of service, but from one traumatic traffic stop in retirement. That evening, as James sat in his living room reviewing draft legislation, Catherine brought him a cup of tea and a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she asked, signing simultaneously. The headline read, "Officer in Holloway Incident Requests Meeting with Deaf Community Leaders." James raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. Perhaps there was hope yet. Even for Officer Travis Cole. The police academy auditorium buzzed with anticipation. 24 fresh-faced recruits sat in press uniforms, notebooks open, eyes fixed on the empty podium at the front of the room. Above it hung a banner. "Communication first, new protocols for interacting with differently abled citizens." At precisely 9 a.m., the side door opened. James Holloway entered, accompanied by an ASL interpreter and a service dog handler. The recruits stood in unison, a gesture of respect that brought a small smile to James's weathered face. "Please sit," signed James, his movements fluid and confident. The interpreter voiced his words as Catherine Holloway helped her father to the podium. 3 months ago, the interpreter spoke as James signed, "I was thrown against the hood of my own car because an officer wasn't trained to recognize that I'm deaf. Today, I'm here to ensure none of you ever make that mistake." For the next hour, James walked the recruits through a series of scenarios: traffic stops, emergency calls, public disturbances, all involving deaf individuals. He demonstrated proper visual cues, introduced the new communication cards each patrol car would now carry, and explained common misconceptions about lip reading. "Only about 30% of English is visible on the lips," the interpreter voiced as James signed. "Even the best lip readers miss most of what's said. Never assume a deaf person understands you just because they're nodding." In the back row, Academy Director Captain Reynolds leaned toward Chief Greer. "The recruits are more engaged than I've seen them all year," he whispered. "This should have been standard training decades ago." Greer nodded, his expression somber. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to create change." As the session concluded, James introduced his final exercise. "I want each of you to experience 30 minutes of patrol duty without being able to hear," he signed. "You'll wear these specialized earplugs that block all sound. Your instructors will create scenarios for you to handle." The recruits looked nervously at one another as assistants distributed the earplugs. 30 minutes of silence might change your entire perspective," James continued. "It certainly changed Officer Cole's." A ripple of whispers moved through the room at the mention of Cole's name. His suspension had become a national news story, his face the reluctant symbol of police misconduct toward the disabled. After the training session, James sat in the Academy's small conference room, reviewing evaluations with Captain Reynolds. A knock at the door interrupted them. "Commissioner," Reynolds said, looking uncomfortable, "Officer Cole is here. For your scheduled meeting." James nodded calmly, though his heartbeat quickened slightly. He hadn't seen Travis Cole since that night on the street. Travis entered, his uniform gone, dressed instead in civilian clothes. The past 3 months had aged him visibly, dark circles underlined his eyes, and his previously rigid posture had softened. He carried a manila folder in hands that trembled slightly. "Commissioner Holloway," he began awkwardly. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." James nodded, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. The interpreter positioned herself to Travis's right. "I've been..." Travis hesitated, searching for words. "I've been required to watch a lot of videos as part of my disciplinary program. Videos of deaf people being mistreated by police." His voice cracked slightly. "Including the one of me and you." James watched him steadily, his expression neutral but attentive. Travis opened the folder, removing several sheets of paper. "I've completed the department's new deaf awareness training. And I've been taking an ASL class at the community college 3 nights a week." He attempted a basic introduction in sign language, clumsy but recognizable. James's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. "I know it doesn't make up for what happened," Travis continued. "But I'm trying to understand. To change." James considered him for a long moment before signing, the interpreter translating. "Why are you really here, Officer Cole?" Travis swallowed hard. "The departmental review is complete. I've been offered reinstatement with probation, contingent on your approval." A tense silence filled the room. "And if I don't approve?" James signed. "Then I lose my badge permanently," Travis answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because..." He took a deep breath. "Because I needed to tell you that you were right. A badge isn't just power. It's responsibility. I forgot that. Or maybe I never really understood it until now." James studied the younger man, searching for signs of insincerity. Finding none, he signed. "The hardest lesson for any officer to learn is that the uniform doesn't make you superior, it makes you a servant." Travis nodded slowly. "I know that now." James picked up a pen and wrote on his notepad, "You can still change." The same words he'd said in their final confrontation that night, now offered not as a challenge, but as genuine encouragement. 2 weeks later, the governor's office issued a press release announcing the passage of the Holloway Act, requiring all law enforcement agencies in the state to implement comprehensive disability awareness training. The accompanying photos showed James at the signing ceremony, flanked by advocates from the deaf community. In the background, barely visible but present, stood Officer Travis Cole in his newly reinstated uniform, serving as security detail for the event, his first assignment since returning to duty. That evening, at the Police Academy graduation ceremony, James delivered the keynote address. As the new officers received their badges, each one was also given a special card with basic ASL signs for emergency situations. "Today marks a new beginning," James signed as the interpreter spoke. "Not just for these new officers, but for our entire approach to policing. True justice cannot exist without communication. And true protection means serving everyone, especially those who experience the world differently than you do." As the ceremony concluded, James watched the newly minted officers celebrating with their families. Among them was Officer Rodriguez, the first graduating cadet with cochlear implants, speaking in sign language with his deaf parents. Beside them stood Travis Cole, awkwardly but earnestly attempting to follow their conversation in ASL. Catherine squeezed her father's hand. "You've started something important, Dad." James nodded, signing. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the greatest change." As they walked toward the exit, James passed a wall of photographs, commissioners through the years. His own portrait hung there, taken before the explosion that took his hearing. Beside it now hung a new plaque, unveiling the department's official adoption of the Holloway Protocols for Inclusive Policing. His legacy, once defined by his years of service, would now be measured by one fateful traffic stop and everything that came after, a moment of injustice transformed into a movement for change.